you.
All right, good evening, and thank you for joining us on this Friday night. This is Live with Faye. Remember, every evening at 8 o'clock, we bring you a conversation which helps us understand issues better. And we have to have a conversation about vaccines. And the reason why we've taken these many days to have this conversation is because we were trying to put together the best possible panel that anyone could have put together on this vaccine. And I'm proud to say we've done a fairly good job. Now, what I also did was on Twitter a few hours ago, I asked people, what is your biggest question about the COVID vaccine right now? This was 4 hours ago. I, as of now, have 726 questions on Twitter. And I've taken a lot of those questions in. We'll also pick up some of the questions from our chat window as we are live. And I ask the indulgence and the patience of my panel because some of these questions might seem a little simplistic, but this is what people are talking about right now. So just to give you a quick update about where we are. This is what it sounded like. Yay, we have a vaccine. We're going to have it by the end of maybe mid next year. And then news started creeping in about side effects, about adverse effects of vaccines. People started asking questions, not getting too many answers. So then we started talking about the lack of transparency. And then we started talking about regulation and how regulation works. In India, of course, we're also asking questions of who's going to get it, what it's going to cost, and how are we going to make sure that it reaches the ends and the corners of this very vast country. To give you an idea of the kind of side effects we're talking about and whether or not we should be worried about it, our panel will answer that question. Pfizer, for example, Britain, Bahrain, Canada have authorized the Pfizer vaccine. 2 people in the UK developed allergic reactions. 4 volunteers in the US apparently have developed facial paralysis symptoms. And this really caused a lot of concern. Now, in India, we have the Bharat Biotech vaccine and the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine that's being tested by the Serum Institute. Bharat Biotech, we of course had the Union Health Minister, we had a minister of Haryana who very publicly, volunteered as, as a candidate. He got 1 dose and then he got COVID, and then people got really worried about the efficacy of this vaccine, and we're going to talk about that as well. Also, there's been 1 case of viral pneumonitis. I'm not sure what that is, but we'll ask the panel. Also, with the AstraZeneca vaccine, which the Serum Institute is testing in India, there was 1 case of serious adverse effects. The person in the trial decided to sue the company decided to sue the person. We still don't know what the details are of that case, and that brings us back to the question then of transparency. We're also going to talk about India's ability to vaccinate, which we have a pretty decent ability, and India's ability to manufacture the vaccines and what that's going to mean for all of us. Now, let me get to the panel. Like I said, my team has done an excellent job, so I'm very proud of this panel. Starting with Dr. Shahid Jameel, who's a virologist and an academic, and has been very kind to give us his time through the course of this entire pandemic. He's been very generous with his time. Professor Srinath Reddy is the president of the Public Health Foundation and understands healthcare in India better than most people. Ms. Poonam Muttreja is the executive director of the Population Foundation of India. She has years and years of grassroots experience in public health policy. Dinesh Thakur is a public health activist focused on improving quality of affordable medicines across the globe, and he's done some amazing work. In fact, when you're done with the show, you should Google him. You'll find it very interesting. And of course, Murali Neelakantan is it says principal Amicus, but is really super lawyer. He's a super lawyer who was previously executive director and global general counsel at Glenmark Pharmaceuticals, and he understands the law around approvals and pharmaceuticals as well. Interestingly, overseas, there's this idea of big pharma and how it takes advantage of situations. In India, we don't see pharma as big pharma because just getting medicines is a big deal in India, but we've had problems in India, and Dinesh Thakur will help us understand those problems better. Now, getting back to our 750 questions, 732 questions. It's gone up by 10 since I started talking. One of the questions, and I'll take this to everyone in the panel because I want everybody to just let me know if you want to answer the question. The biggest question that popped up was of adverse effects. Have we done enough trials? Do we know what the effect of taking this vaccine will be. Things like facial paralysis and neurological symptoms sounds really scary. So, is there reason for us to be worried about side effects? I'll take it first to Dr. Jameel. Dr. Jameel, should we be worried about side effects? Are you worried about side effects?
Well, side effects will happen, but most side effects will happen within the first 6 weeks. And that's why you have a 2-month period to give emergency use authorization. Uh, Let us also understand that no drug, no vaccine is 100% safe. In medicine, it is always going to be risk versus benefit. And I'll take you back to the oral polio vaccine, which has done an amazing job of eradicating polio from almost the entire world. Oral polio vaccine causes poliomyelitis in 1 out of 1 million children vaccinated. Now, for that child, it's a 100% strike rate.
Yep.
But when you look at the population level, it's minuscule. So risk versus benefit, and that's very important to understand.
But do we know what the risk is with these vaccines just yet?
We will continue to know more things as time goes on. And so, I mean, I would say that not enough time has gone on simply because, these vaccines have come so quickly. Remember when COVID vaccines were going to be developed, it was, the time schedule was 18 months. We're not even 12 months into it, and we have, a couple of vaccines that have been approved and they are already going into people. So yes, I mean, celebration of science, but, there's always two sides to a coin. So be careful.
Well, you said the magical EUA, which is Emergency Usage Authorization, and we've had some confusion in India regarding that. Over the last couple of days, it was said that Serum Institute, Bharat Biotech have applied for EUA. Then the news said that the government has denied, which the government came out and said is fake news. Then the news said that the government has refused to give it to them, which the government came out and said it's fake news. Now we've discovered that there's no such thing as EUA in India. And let me take that then to Dinesh Thakur, who's just written a piece on it. Emergency usage as a form of authorization doesn't exist in India, does it?
Yeah, so, if you think about, as Dr. Jameel just said, right? So I think, in order for me to answer that question, if you allow me 2 minutes,
Please.
Let's try and understand the approval process, right? So, and then we'll talk about what does emergency do to it. Whenever you put a drug or a vaccine or a device out in the market, there are a couple of things that the regulator looks at, right? The first thing, as Dr. Jameel just said, is benefit versus risk, right? Let me just give you a simple example. If you have headache, right, you wouldn't want to take a medicine that actually makes your hair fall out. So the benefit for the headache is that the headache goes away. The risk is that you'll get your hair falling out, right? That is an unacceptable risk, for the benefit that you get. But imagine if you are suffering from cancer and you have to undergo chemotherapy, right? One of the side effects of taking and undergoing chemotherapy is hair loss. We all know that. But in that case, that risk is acceptable, right? Because it saves your life in the long run. So the question is that what is the benefit risk that Dr. Jameel just talked about? And is that acceptable to us, right? So when we get approval to market either a drug or a device or a vaccine, there are 4 different things that we look at, right? One is what is the benefit versus the risk, and is that acceptable, right? Second thing is what is the dosage, right? There's been a lot of discussion about this vaccine to say that, is 1 dose enough to trigger immunogenicity? Or do you need to have 2 doses, a booster dose later on, right? So what is the dosage, right? The third thing that we have to worry about is what kind of interaction does it have with other things that one may be taking? Remember what we just learned very early from the initial vaccinations that have happened in UK is that people who are prone to allergies, right? These are people who carry what is called an EpiPen, right? People who suffer anaphylaxis. Yes. For them, it's actually creating, adverse events, right? So we need to figure out, what other things that, potentially a drug would cause in you. and you would exclude that population, right? Children, for example, right now is a population that we think about. So what I'm trying to say is that the regulator's job is to review all of these things in order to give approval. Now, in that context, what is emergency approval? Emergency approval basically says that before you get all of this data, because you see a risk in a pandemic-like situation, you are actually giving a limited approval, right? A limited approval saying that you continue doing the studies that you're doing. You continue to test this vaccine in the clinical study that you're conducting. While you're doing that, because, as Dr. Jameel said, in terms of population benefit, you are actually allowing people to get it, and you're monitoring this. Now, in our construct, in the law that governs Drugs and Cosmetics Act in India, which is the Drugs and Cosmetics Act of 1940 and the New Drugs and Clinical Trial Rules of 2019, we do not have a provision for what is called an emergency use authorization as it's defined in UK and US and other countries. We have something called an accelerated approval, which Murali can talk about from legal point of view, and it creates a lot of confusion because we don't pay attention to words that we use, right? Emergency use does not mean that you stop testing, that you stop monitoring these patients. As Dr. Jameel said, typical vaccines, will give you adverse events if they do in the 6 to 8 week period, right? You will see that. Beyond that, it's a long-term follow-up to see what's going on. So that's kind of the overall conversation. I'll stop there and just give you, that's the context of the discussion.
Mr. Neelakantan, do you want to take us through, our sort of accelerated use in India and what that means? And also, I think that fundamentally the question that we're answering here is the lack of transparency, because everyone in the country wants to know what's going on with the vaccines. What happened at the Serum Institute trial? What happened at the Bharat Biotech trial? We're not getting many answers. Is there a lack of transparency in the way India is dealing with these vaccines?
You should not be surprised, because we've always had a lack of transparency. If you go back to 4 or 5 months ago, when we had approval of supposedly the magic cure for COVID, we had 3 drugs, and we sold a ton of HCQS. Suddenly, then somebody told us that Favipiravir is the next wonderful thing, and it's just a pill, everybody can take it, and we'll all be fine. And then everybody stopped, at least some of us stopped and said, explain to us how you came to this conclusion. And we didn't see very much data. The regulator should have told us, this is the basis on which we approved it. This is the data we saw. This is the science. This is why we think it will work. Then we had itolizumab, which is classic of how bad the regulatory system is. It was a trial which no self-respecting scientist would hold up and sign his name to it. It was TV drama. You had lots of TV channels with celebrity doctors selling this drug. Never been done in India before. We don't advertise drugs with celebrities on TV channels, but it was done. And when the company was asked, please explain to us how you got this approval. When the regulator was asked, please explain to us under which provision of law you gave this company the approval. There was absolute lack of transparency. Until, if you read Dinesh's article, we got a response. There was a lot of misinformation on exactly on what basis and what criteria the regulator approved it. Now, as Dinesh said, we have 2 provisions in the new clinical trial rules. One deals with accelerated approval. The other deals with expedited review. All this means is the bureaucracy can work quicker. It doesn't allow you to short circuit science. With the lack of transparency, the risk you have is people think science has been short circuited. And to me, that's the big concern. So using terms like emergency authorization just undermines our regulatory system, because it creates words that supposedly mean a lot and sound very important, but actually don't exist. I'm reminded of Orwell, a very interesting essay for those who are interested in it. It is Politics and the English Language, where he says people make up these words, especially bureaucrats, people in power, that actually don't have any meaning but sound very, very important. And EUA in the Indian context is really one of those words. If you came out and said, we've approved it as accelerated approval, there's a criteria for it. There's 4 criteria if you meet it. If you say it's expedited review, there's a different set of criteria for it. And then we can see, did you actually meet it? Where's the data for it? So the undermining of the regulatory system is done by government. So we have bureaucrats. In the last webinar that was done by the health ministry, they had a slide which said EUA, EUA, EUA. When the question was asked, it was palmed off to somebody else who said, please look at the law, it is there. When we found out through RTI, thanks to Dinesh, that the itolizumab approval was not under a particular provision which was touted on TV, then we have to ask the question, under which provision was it authorized? Strangely, even the SEC, which is the experts, the doctors reviewing this data, have used the term EUA. So it's a way in which you can make up these words, sound very impressive, fool the population, even some journalists, and try to say that this is all very scientific. And that's the scare that I think some of us have. And you've seen the outcome of that, right? You've got bad regulation, the way it is being used in this crisis, undermining the science. And suddenly you have people saying, Array, the consequence of vaccine is I might get COVID, and the consequence of kada is I won't. So bad science and fake science gets treated on par with good science because of the way our regulators are dealing with it. That is my biggest fear. People will get put off vaccines. I mean, I've seen some of the questions that people have asked, right, on Twitter. And they're saying, well, if I'm going to get COVID having taken the vaccine, I might as well take Babaji's something and not get it.
Yes.
So it undermines public health and acceptability of the vaccine. To me, that's the big risk of regulation being done badly.
And I'll come back to you on a couple of other points. But before I bring in the public health experts, just going back to Dr. Jameel, do you feel we're short-circuiting science here? Because it's true that people are saying, and a lot of the questions, surprisingly for me on Twitter said, can I opt out of it?
Yes.
Is it compulsory? Can I choose not to get it? Which is indicative of a certain mistrust, Dr. Jameel.
Well, I mean, if you talk about science, we are at this stage because of science. Yeah. So there should really be no reason to short circuit science. I think both the gentlemen, Dinesh, and I'm sorry, I didn't catch the other name.
Murali Neelakantan.
They're right. Science should not be short circuited. Communications is very important to build trust. Transparency is very important to build trust. If there is one thing that has been lacking throughout the response to COVID in India, it's transparency and trust.
And we'll come back to transparency and trust, but to bring in the public health experts, one again, a very common question I got, and there's valid confusion around this because the government has sent out so many mixed messages. The question is, what will it cost? Will it be free? Will it cost us something? Will we have to pay? Dr. Reddy, what will it cost? Do we know? Or is it likely to be free? Is there
before I answer that question, may I deal also with the issue of adverse effects?
Please do. Please do.
Firstly, it's absolutely important that we ensure the safety. It is even more important than the efficacy component because we are giving it to healthy people in order to prevent them from getting into harm. But when we talk about adverse effects, firstly, we have to compare what the incidence of the adverse effects is in the immunized group versus the unimmunized group. Then see whether it is because of the vaccine or is it because of some other reason. Is it causal or coincidental? For example, the Bell's palsy part of it, it is an affliction of the facial nerve which often occurs in winters in many people, and it passes off generally without too much of residual harm. So is it related to the vaccine or unrelated to the vaccine? Is the incidence more than in the general population or the same or less than the general population? So these are the questions that regulators must look at and then satisfy themselves. Secondly, the trial must be completed. There's no doubt that we must have complete data and transparency, and rushing through regulatory approvals is absolutely impermissible, because here particularly you're dealing with healthy people. But also, the trial itself, however large it is, often doesn't give the answers about all the adverse effects. For example, in the Pfizer trial, Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine in UK, these instances of anaphylactoid reaction came up not during the trial. They came after the trial was completed and the general population started getting immunized. So you continue to keep your vigilance in what is called phase 4, post-marketing surveillance or post-administration. You have a much larger population to whom you're administering, and you still keep track of adverse events. And if they are problematic, then you reevaluate. So there are cautionary steps need to be taken at every level. But at the same time, every adverse effect is not necessarily related to the vaccine. It could be just coincidental. And that's where the regulator must really exercise good appraisal. Coming to the cost question, I believe, as a matter of principle, that the vaccine must be available to every person free of cost, whether it's going to come from tax funding, employer funding, or other sources. For the simple reason, just any economist would tell you that the classical example of what is called a public good is to prevent the spread of infection or an infectious disease, particularly in an epidemic situation. Because you're not only benefiting the individual concerned, you're benefiting others who are being protected from infection. On the ground of public good, economists advise that it should be public financed from tax funding. Now, I would extend that principle entirely to the entire population. There is no reason why it should be costed. We can get additional revenues from whatever sources, including employers paying for it. But nobody should be prevented from getting a vaccine he or she wants to get because of the cost barrier.
And I'll just bring in Poonam, Muttreja as well. The question, I mean, and the confusion is coming because this became part of politics. It was a political sort of promise that was made in the Bihar election, saying everyone in Bihar will get the vaccine. Nobody knew if that meant for free or will we get it first. We don't know how this is actually going to happen. So has there been any formal communication from the government so far on the cost and on who will get this first? Ms. Muttreja?
I'm not aware of any certainty and formal communication from the government. In fact, the last communication from the health ministry, the briefing, was really vague. In fact, they said, I don't know how we'll get any confidence, but they said, we have the health ministry has said that the vaccines may require 2 doses or 3 doses, which could be given 3 or 4 weeks apart. If we are not there and we don't, the health ministry doesn't know that, very little. And in terms of, on COVID, unfortunately, most decisions have been political decisions. They have not been really decisions made by public health experts with authority and announcing. All of them have been used, all decisions that have been announced so far, and I'm not talking about vaccines, have been political, but vaccines too. By that logic, it is Bengal that will get first because the next election is in Bengal. So I don't believe we know very much. I don't believe that the health ministry, definitely at this point, because probably, and Srinath, correct me if I'm wrong, it's the PMO and Niti Aayog and maybe some donors will decide together. We don't know who's going to make the decision. So what can I say? But I want to say something about, I do want to say something about the side effects and efficacy. I'm not talking about efficacy, just the adverse effects or side effects. I'm sitting here actually quite amused listening all these days, not just today, to our worry about side effects. And I'm so glad we are worried about side effects. You and I have talked often about contraceptives. every contraceptive, almost every contraceptive has side effects, and from serious to complex side effects too. And no one in the country has worried about women getting side effects. For me, this is also partly an aha moment where I want to hear about us worry also about the side effects of contraceptives. In fact, and say, the majority of the population, I mean, we could be using condoms. Now, I know this is not a program about contraceptives, which has no side effects. It could have 3% failure rate at best, right? So why? I mean, I want to ask pleasure principle versus use of condoms. And here, so for me, it's quite a moment. And I think I'd like that to be part of the debate going forward. And finally, I want to say that my biggest worry is management of side effects. There will be side effects, as was said earlier. And I totally agree. There are going to be, and there is going to be risk assessment and so on. And of course, there'll be infodemics. We'll have all kinds of the WhatsApp factories are going to produce all kinds of nonsensical information, wrong information, and so on. But my worry is, India, do we have the ability, capability, to manage the side effects, to record the side effects, to follow and then manage? I don't believe we are ready, and polio vaccine is a great example, is a success story. But let's also remember it's very different. And this, we're talking about side effects, and we're talking about, that was oral. You talked about oral vaccine, and, you just have to pop it into the mouth, while this is going to be an injection, which is going to rewind. Finally, my third worry is that if we are so, given the side effects, and given that we are going to have to spend so much energy of this very weak public health system, which is in ICU, which has fallen through the cracks, how are we going to, what is going to happen, even if we get our act together 50%, okay, to vaccinate? And I absolutely agree with Srinath, it has to be free, it should be free. I don't know what will happen to the other essential services. So, right, they're going to be, we're going to create more deaths. There are going to be more deaths. We're going to have more health burden of disease, then reducing the burden of disease. So India has to really take this seriously and do some good thinking with health scientists. Okay, we want Srinath Reddy's to decide, not the politicians.
So just to explain to our audience, what Ms. Muttreja means is that obviously every public health officer, worker, ASHA worker will be pressed into the job of distributing, transporting vaccines, which means that all of the other care that we hand out, treatment, checkups for pregnant women, malnourishment checkups for small babies, all of this, all the other healthcare work that happens will stop, which we saw it happen also in the beginning of the lockdown, because all these workers were pressed into actually going and checking people and checking temperature. And so none of the other work happened. Can we afford that again? And that's it's a ballooning problem that's looming over this country. But Dr. Reddy, do you want to comment on what Ms. Muttreja said before I introduce the next question to the panel?
No, I entirely agree. I mean, I don't think we can have a very narrow vision of health that we only deal with one emergency at a time. We have to look at all the healthcare needs of the population and ensure that they are being met appropriately. Apart from the fact that we should have invested a lot more in our health system and particularly our health workforce, I think even now, as far as immunization is concerned, we have to plan it in stages and see that basically we give it to the people who are most vulnerable and also the essential health workforce who are first need to be protected, and then roll it out in stages so that we have adequate supplies of the vaccine as well as adequate health workforce, supplemented if necessary with other trained vaccinators to administer the vaccine, monitor the side effects, but without derailing any of the other health programs which are so essential.
Yes, Murali Neelakantan, do you want to respond to that? The cost of the vaccines and who's going to pay for it?
There are two things, actually. One was a question that you asked and I didn't answer, which was on causation and adverse effect. I think if you see the transparency that you've had from the other regulators on the adverse effect or side effects that have been caused during the trial, whether it is caused by the vaccine or not is questionable. But if you see what they have said, they haven't been 100% sure, which is how science needs to be. It needs to be humble. It needs to acknowledge that we don't know. Whereas if you see what the Indian regulator has said, we are 100% sure it was not caused by the vaccine. Suddenly, when you make these statements, which scientists will just revolt against and say, hold on, this is not, you need to be a little humble when you're a scientist and say, we don't think, we haven't found. Doesn't mean it does not exist. The big difference between the two. And so if you want acceptability of the vaccine, you want people to trust the vaccine, you got to be upfront with them and say, listen, we think it's highly unlikely. This is the research we've done. This is the data we have found. We think it's highly unlikely. To say, no, it does not happen, scares the moderates. To me, that's the worry. The second one was on cost. The finance minister very worryingly said earlier this week that she doesn't know the cost of vaccination. To me, that's a little scary. You've had a lot of time to figure it out. The government has been speaking to vaccine makers, I hope, for many months now. At least the Prime Minister said that he's working and the PMO said that they're working. So I assume they're working. So by now, you would have figured out the cost. The vaccines have already been made. So it is not in development stage. So we know what the cost is. They've stocked crores of doses of vaccines already. So we know the cost. We know from experience of public health and vaccinations what it will cost to deliver these vaccines. So what scares me is not knowing the cost of it and saying it publicly in almost an arrogant way. Oh, we don't know the cost of it is really scary. And that's exactly why I think people like Professor Srinath Reddy need to be listened to and say, please don't message things like this. Yes, we won't know to the last penny, but yes, we've got the money for it and we will pay for it.
For me, Murali, the thing that was scary was on the 30th of November, there was a story in all of our newspapers that said the Prime Minister interacted with teams from pharma companies about the vaccine and asked them to suggest ideas on regulatory process, effectively asking the pharma companies for ideas on how they should be regulated. That's like, asking for want of better analogies, my apologies to pharma companies, but asking kids in school to basically write their own rules.
I think it is to do with what has happened earlier. So I think what he was offering up is we've done these wonderful things for the drug companies. So I've given them all toffees. Would you like ice cream too? Stuff like that. And that, again, is very worrying. Nowhere else in the world will you have regulation without consulting, public health scientists, civil rights activists, health activists, all the stakeholders before you come out with regulations. So yes, it is worrying when you ask, the crooks whether who their policemen should be. It is really worrying, especially in a health area. I think it would be less important if it was soap, but I see the problem with honey these days. So what can you say?
Well, this is like a complicated question that's coming from Abhimanyu, and I'll take this to Dr. Jameel if I may. Doc, this is the question. The adenovirus vector vaccines do not have a track record to be deployed at this scale, this quickly. There's a Lancet piece on how the approach went wrong with HIV, which is now public. China is using the tried and tested method of the inactivated virus. Which of these two do you think is a better model? Do you think we're rushing on the adenovirus and we should perhaps rethink it?
Well, it's not entirely true that adenovirus vaccines haven't been tested. They were tested on 60,000 people during Ebola. Yeah. So there is a track record. What is correct is that there is so far no licensed adenovirus vaccine for human use. The disadvantage of an adenovirus vaccine is that once you have taken an adenovirus vaccine, the next vaccine you take cannot be on an adenovirus platform. because that vaccine will not be efficacious. Your body will raise an immune response very rapidly to adenovirus, and it will inactivate the vaccine. So that is where actually the RNA technology is the best, because it has no vector sequences. Tomorrow, if there is a major mutation in the COVID protein, you can very quickly make a RNA vaccine. You will not be able to make an adenovirus vaccine. So RNA vaccine is actually the vaccine of the future. Adenovirus platform has an issue. And that is why if you remember, the Russian vaccine actually deploys two adenoviruses. It gives the first shot as an adeno 26, which is a rare adenovirus in the human population, and then comes up with a boost of adenovirus 5, which is a more common adenovirus in the human population.
So see both.
So,
Dr. Reddy, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, actually, the problem has been with adenovirus 5. When adenovirus 5 was used in the testing of HIV vaccines, it was found that paradoxically, the uptake of the HIV virus, the pathogenic virus, was increased because of the adenovirus 5. And that's why it was given up. So there is still an ongoing concern whether adenovirus 5 is really safe or not. Similar concern has not been raised about adenovirus 26, but there is something that needs to be really guarded against as we go into these uncharted territories.
Well, but I can see Dinesh Thakur nodding as well. Do you want to weigh in on what the world is thinking about this, about these choices?
So I think that, what's interesting is this, right? The mRNA vaccines that Dr. Jameel was talking about, that certainly is the future, right? Because it provides a platform, and very quickly we can compress in creating a vaccine candidate using the same platform. But then I would want to turn around and actually address what Dr. Reddy just said, right? We as a country don't have the infrastructure to store these vaccines at the temperatures that they require it to be while distributed, right? I mean, at this point in time, because of the development cycle of these vaccines, we don't have enough stability data to say how long do these mRNA vaccines actually survive in the distribution cycle. I mean, if you think about rural India, it's very difficult for us to even have a refrigerator at 4 degrees consistently because we don't have electricity. How are we going to distribute these vaccines that require storage at minus 90 degrees? I mean, we have a whole different set of problems that we have to think about when we think about, our poor public health infrastructure. That I think that, folks like Dr. Reddy and Dr. Jameel, they have their input is extremely valuable, but we can't do exactly what the US and UK are doing with the Pfizer vaccine or Moderna vaccine because we just don't have the infrastructure. So
from my understanding, Poonam, Muttreja, is that we can actually cool something to minus 2 degrees, but we can't go to the minus 70 degrees that the Pfizer vaccine needs. Is that correct?
Plus 2 to 8.
Absolutely.
And so do you believe, Ms. Muttreja, I have to ask the question now that, we've had most of the newspaper articles that have written about this have said that India has the world's biggest inoculation mission. We've vaccinated more people than anywhere else in the world, which means we already have some sort of infrastructure of distribution in place. Like you said, there's a difference between polio drops, which just need to be dropped in someone's mouth, and things that don't need to be kept below freezing temperatures. Vis-a-vis actually injecting the same person twice over 4 weeks, which means tracking that person down and making sure the person takes the second dose, and refrigerating, transporting, administering. In your opinion, are we ready for that? Or do we just
No, I don't believe we are ready for that, even though we have the infrastructure, but we are not vaccinating people in one go. It's when a baby's born or it's, and what Srinath said, we need to sequence it for us to say in 6 months or even in a year, we'll be able to vaccinate everybody. No, that's not possible. We'll have to prioritize. We don't have the health infrastructure unless we do it in a mission more and involve not just the private sector, but which I'm not suggesting, but it'll have to be a private-public partnership. And when I say private sector, I'm not referring necessarily to giving the service. I'm referring to a good management plan, and by somebody outside the government with the government. So that's the supply side management, but the side effects, the demand, the reaching the remote areas, for instance, that is going to be the very big challenge. I can see the privileged, the powerful in the cities having access, but how are we going to reach the last mile? How are we going to reach even the elderly across? We've said we'll give, above 60 will be the second priority after the health workers. I don't see us there. Even currently, our immunization, we are not, without COVID also, we are not able to reach a very large number of even newborns. So how, prenatal care, postnatal care, including immunization, there have been good experiments by NGOs or institutions. Again, PHFI was leading one of the immunization programs, but I don't see us having the infrastructure, being anywhere near it. This is an opportunity for us, perhaps. It is a great opportunity for us to not only reimagine India's public health, but distribution system. We can't distribute condoms. Where will we distribute vaccines?
I also must remind our viewers, when we say distribute vaccines to all of India, we're not just talking about the vaccine. There's also a syringe, a needle, disposing of that syringe and needle, finding people who can actually use the syringe and needle without causing more harm than good. All of these things, the refrigerated containers in which this has to move. And data, actually, yes, go ahead.
Money is not the issue. In fact, my eyes on the PM Cares Fund. I am sure it can fund, and they can get more money to fund. So how about that? I want to know what the PM's fund is going to contribute. I want to know if we can have a really good management plan. And to me, private sector does not mean giving them contracts and profit maximization. I am talking about a role for the private sector where it's going to be a service to the country, because each one of them are going to benefit exponentially, financially in the long run. So there has to be a pact. We are not doing any thinking. We are not doing any discussion. We are not doing any debate.
We're doing discussion debate right now.
Yes, that's the only place we're doing it. So let's have a couple of them, Faye, and give a plan to India.
I love the fact that an unpaid independent journalist now needs to substitute the work that needs to be done by government. Yes. But I must point out that when you mentioned the PM Cares Fund, everyone on the panel laughed, because of the audacity of that suggestion, except Dr. Reddy, who obviously knows more than the rest of us. Dr. Reddy, what do you know?
No.
He doesn't laugh at me.
I also laughed. I might not have laughed loud enough for you to notice, but but no, I do not know where the money is going to come from. But the money has to come from the government, and it can mobilize whatever sources. It can tax certain section of the rich more. I have no problem with that. But the whole issue here is, if a person who needs protection is not immunized, that person is likely to be severely ill or die. If a person who gets infected because he or she has been denied the vaccine goes and infects 10 others, then that is a negative externality which is absolutely unacceptable. So that is why we call it a public good to immunize people, particularly in the face of an epidemic. And there the government has the responsibility of mobilizing resources and ensuring that whoever needs it and wants it gets it.
Very well said. Dr. Jameel, a couple of questions for you. One is this a lifelong immunization? Is it 1 year? Is this something we'll have to take year after year? Is there any way to know, given the fact that we've not tested it for a long period of time? Secondly, will someone who takes the vaccine still transmit the virus to other people? or will the transmission of virus stop? And the third question is, if I've already had COVID, do I need to be vaccinated?
All right. So let me start with the last question first. If you have had COVID, uh, you possibly don't need the vaccine simply because vaccine is not going to give you protection that's better than natural infection. You may have low levels of antibody, but then you will have a memory response. And that memory response is going to not prevent infection, but it will prevent disease. And so the purpose of a vaccine is not just to prevent infection. If a vaccine prevents disease, that's good enough. And there are many, many diseases for which we vaccinate that do not give what we call sterilizing immunity. They do not prevent infection, but they prevent disease. Now, if you get vaccinated, will you be able to transmit? Most likely not, because even if you get infected, the viral load is going to be low, and the lower the viral load, the less is the chance of transmitting it to the next person. Finally, how long will immunity last? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. We don't even know how long immunity lasts in a natural infection, which has been going on for much longer than a vaccine trial. So we'll have to wait and see. If we simply go by what other coronaviruses do, other coronaviruses that are endemic to the human population cause about 20 to 30% of annual common colds. So my hunch is that immunity will not last more than possibly a year or 2 years. So that's all I can guess. I don't know the real answers to those questions.
I think that's the bravest answer we have received. Again, we would love to have everyone on this panel also work with the government, because we'd like to hear some honest answers from there as well. But here's the interesting thing, and I'm bringing this back to the panel, the question of data. There've been, again, articles that have been written about the fact that we might have in this country underplayed our data a great deal. Now, for those state governments that underplayed their infection numbers or their caseloads, they are now going to be very disappointed, because if they'd given the honest numbers, they would have to buy fewer vaccines if they don't need to inoculate someone who had COVID. But let's talk about data. Did we study specifically the impact of the virus on Indian bodies and Indian weather and Indian environment? Do we have enough data of how, if any, the virus has mutated or changed, or what, for example, our antibodies are, for how long they last in our system, and do they prevent further infection? Do we have enough data in this country to understand this virus? Yes or no? Anyone who wants to answer this question? Dinesh, Dinesh Thakur, I'll take it to you first. You're mute. Yes.
Yeah, I'm probably the worst person to answer this, because I have no insight into what the studies currently are being underway. Perhaps Dr. Jameel or Dr. Reddy would probably be better positioned to answer. But I just had one simple point to make before I kind of let that be, is that I don't know how many of us actually watched. Yesterday was the AdCom meeting of the US FDA.
Yeah.
There were 21
live
external advisors, and it was streamed live. Right?
Yep.
All of those people who made the decisions, who voted 17 to 1, one person abstained and 4 said no.
17 to 4.
And now,
17
and
to
now
4.
they correct. And now even the 4 who actually voted no are actually telling us why they did, because the question that was framed was whether we actually used children in the age group of 16 to 18. Okay. The reason I'm saying this is, just compare this to how our subject expert committees work, the ones that advise the BCGI, right? We don't even know the membership of the subject expert committees. We don't know whether what conflict of interest they actually have. Just look at what happened yesterday. A day-long meeting, 8 hours, right? All the data was presented. People disagreed. There was no consensus, when it came to children, inoculating children between 16 to 18 years of age. The reason I'm saying this is these kind of efforts build confidence in public, saying that, you know what, the decisions that are being made on science. And the reason this was important was because 2-3 months ago, the Trump administration was doing exactly, you know, the way that we function in our country, right? So they essentially, you know, were trying to put political pressure to try and get, vaccines approved earlier. And so this was a completely orthogonal reaction by the US FDA to hold a public meeting, streaming live. Any journalist, any individual could just, you know, watch this. That is how you build confidence. Transparency actually and sunlight, you know, builds confidence that people who are now thinking about perhaps not taking are saying, you know what, if 17 experts said yes, there must be something right about this vaccine, right? So that's the only point that I wanted to make when we were talking about data and availability of data. Thank you.
Murali?
No, I think the question is to the others on data. It's science, and lawyers are the worst at answering questions on science. So we'll stick to law.
Okay,
But
all right.
the three doctors can tell us this.
Dr. Reddy, I'm going to take that question to you. Do we have enough data right now to be able to strategize our approach on the vaccine?
Well, I think as far as Indian data are concerned, they're still being gathered through ongoing trials. And even the AstraZeneca trial is a very small arm of the large international trial. I don't think we can draw conclusions specific to India on the basis of that trial. Till we see all these trials completed and the data fully shared with the regulators as well as in open scientific media for others to scrutinize, we really can't say we have adequate Indian data available.
So there is one question about how this will reach rural India and who will be prioritized. We know that the government has broken this up into phases and said that healthcare workers will be prioritized first, after which we don't know what second or third phase is going to look like. Also, there was an interesting statement that came out saying not everybody is going to be vaccinated. We're just going to vaccinate enough to break the chain. Dr. Reddy, do you want to explain to us what that means?
Well, basically, I think what they are saying, and not what I am saying, right, is that if the people who are likely to be most vulnerable to get exposed and infected are protected, then they're unlikely to pass on the virus to others, and others are not as likely to get infected because of their employment or their other reasons why they may be less likely to encounter the virus. So the idea is that the more people who are most likely to get infected and pass on to others should be immunized first, apart from the people who are most vulnerable to get the most severe infection. Therefore, you are looking at two criteria, and therefore you are trying to break the cycle of transmission by focusing on the people who are likely to be the super spreaders. Unfortunately, we don't know who are the people who are super spreaders based on their characteristics. We only know that there are super spreader events, that people gather in large numbers, whether for religious occasions or political gatherings or social celebrations. And that is when actually you are likely to get super spreader events. And we haven't done much in preventing those. So the idea of what is the critical number that will get immunized to break the cycle of transmission is very difficult to say at this point in time. But since crowd density plays a considerable role, immunizing people in the big cities is going to be an important element. Again, utilizing the criteria A of essentiality and then of vulnerability first, and then trying to see whether we can actually limit the transmission from there to other places downstream.
Hey, may I add a point in addition to what Srinath said?
Please do.
When you deploy a vaccine in a pandemic situation, you deploy it to do three things. First is to protect your frontline workers, your healthcare workers who are handling the healthcare system. The second thing you do is to reduce mortality. And to reduce mortality, you have to focus on groups that show high mortality. And finally, the third thing you do is to reduce the number of people getting infected or to break transmission, so to say. So that's really how one needs to go about. And what the government has so far said is that it is going to look at 3 crore people, 30 million people, 1 million, 30 million, 10 million healthcare workers, 20 million frontline workers, and 27 million people who are above the age of 50, plus those below the age of 50 who have comorbidities. So that's the plan they have. And it looks like a reasonable plan based on at least what we know from how the virus has been behaving.
I just want to address the one point of we did talk about private consultants who putting together teams that will be able to help the government or help the government strategize. Who should these teams be made up of, and what kind of team should the government put together? Because we've seen, we've heard of a task force, like we said, we don't really know who's on that task force right now. How should the government actually design these teams? Ideally, who should be on this team? Poonamji?
Health scientists, public health experts, people from the NGO sector who can participate, and who am I? Researchers, absolutely, and they have to be. I keep saying this is going to be a humongous management exercise, which has to go hand in hand. So we need super smart organizers, managers. It's like managing an event over months, perhaps over more than a year, and while ensuring that routine health services, immunization services don't get compromised. The health ministry must ensure that existing healthcare services, including 13 vaccines that are administered to pregnant women, children, pregnant mothers, are not compromised, and the children in the rollout of the COVID vaccine. So, as well as the states, all decisions are being made at the central level. We need states to be, and independently, every state has to have a plan. You have to give greater authority to district magistrates at the district level. They have to have a plan as to who are the people, apart from frontline health workers, who are the most vulnerable, who are the ones who will not only vulnerable, but who are the ones who are, with comorbidities, etc., etc. So this cannot be planned it cannot be centralized. We absolutely have to decentralize the plan, but not without the health scientists. And I'll tell you who shouldn't be there. The politicians shouldn't be there. I mean, I'm reading the article, which I'm distracted. You sent me, along with 5 other people who sent me the same article.
Dinesh Thakur's article.
Yeah. Sorry.
Dinesh Thakur's article.
While I was talking to you, it's going viral. It's going absolutely viral. And, clearly, people who can one politician should be there, and people who should be on this panel or in the management and planning should be people who can speak out, who can shout out, and who can resist the political pressure that we see is likely and could happen in India. This article puts us already to shame.
So effectively, people like Dr. Reddy and Dr. Jameel, right?
Absolutely.
Yes.
One quick rejoinder to what Poonamji said, right? I think that we have past experience. Just think about a few months ago when, at the center, we decided what was going to be the red zone, what was going to be the orange zone, and what was going to be the green zone. And look how effective it was. The whole thing fell apart, right? You cannot make this decision sitting in Delhi. These have to be decentralized to the states and to the localities where the infections are and the inoculations will occur, right? So I think that, if nothing else, just reinforcing what Poonamji said, We have had this experience not that long ago. We tried to do lockdowns, in a way that the Delhi was trying to dictate, and that didn't really work. That's number one. Number two is the one other role that I think is going to be extremely important in this endeavor is logistics, right? Getting the vaccine to the right people at the right time, it is going to be an extremely important aspect of how we execute this immunization plan. And I think that typically, in this country where I live, Army is probably going to be the one that is going to do that. I'm quite certain that the Indian Army would actually be the right kind of institution to execute the kind of logistics to make sure that the vaccine is delivered to the right location in the district or in the taluka, and it is administered with the right primary healthcare workers, right? Whether it's a frontline nurse or whether it's an ASHA worker that's doing this. That I think is another very important. Logistics is a really important part of it, which I think that we need to plan. We can't sort of just say that it's going to be shipped out to Serum Institute and somehow magically appear in Jharkhand someplace. It won't happen.
So this is my question to the whole panel. Whoever wants to answer it, because I can see all of you right now, is there a lot of room at this point for corruption in that system? I mean, what is stopping the people, that the people of Jharkhand actually just get whales of water, and the actual vaccine winds up somewhere else with, with people who will pay money for it. Is that perhaps a massive risk we're running? And is there a, you did say bring in the army, but is there a plan to mitigate that? And the other question I want to ask, along with those arbitrary lockdown rules that we saw coming in the beginning, there was all of this download Arogya Setu. If you don't have Arogya Setu, you will not be allowed inside any space actually. So it was voluntary, but it was compulsory. Will there also be perhaps this sort of ad hoc rules that will be brought about that you have to get vaccinated, otherwise you will not be able to enter such a building or an airport or a train station, and there's going to be some level of chaos? Is that possible as well if we don't have a decent plan?
Faye, we already have inkling of that. If you've seen the papers in the last couple of days, the Maharashtra government has an app. Of course we have an app. It's called CoWIN. And you got to register on it, and it's asking all of its frontline employees, healthcare workers, to register on that. So it's not a new idea. I think today we have to realize that the first response to any problem is we'll build an app. So there is an app. I think the next thing you have to really worry about is what you discussed, which is likelihood of diversion. So the people who ought to be getting it don't get it because people are allowed to jump the queue. So, let's say a family has 2 drivers, 3 maids, and, they're really the ones who should be getting it. They will be the ones standing in the queue to get it. They will get their whatever stamp saying they've been vaccinated, but it'll be the rich kids would be actually getting it. So it's very likely that it will happen, which is why I think Professor Reddy's idea that it should be free, it should be available widely and in a non-discriminatory manner under the priorities is necessary. That you can't get away by jumping the queue. You can't have people who should be in the front of the queue giving up their places to others who just are privileged and don't necessarily fall in the list of priorities. To me, that's the big risk in India. And we're already seeing that in the press. There was a piece by a very prominent journalist which says that those who can pay should pay and should be able to jump the queue. And I reviled when I saw something like that and said, first, it's immoral. And for those who are interested, should read Michael Sandel's book on what money can't buy. And he talks about why it is a bad idea when it comes to health, education, some of these things, that people are allowed to jump the queue. It happens, he takes the example of the US, of course, but it's a real big issue for us. And this is the worst time to allow something like that to happen. Not only is it immoral, but as Professor Reddy said, it's going to hurt the main purpose, which is people are going to die. So that's the first problem with it. Second is with this idea of immunity passports. We've seen airlines saying that you need to have this stamp which says you've got it before you get on a plane. Will you now have to do it before you get into a mall? Do you have to do it before you get into a cinema theater? I suspect it's going to happen. They've kind of tested it with Arogya Setu, right? And you can game the system. It's a stupid idea. We know all of that. It doesn't work. But here is another chance to game the system. If it's going to be an app that says, I've got a COVID vaccine, it'll take, the boys from Koromangala not very much time to figure out how I can play with the app. And each of us will have a patch which we can put on our phone to say, yes, 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 I've got COVID vaccine. And the code will go on WhatsApp. Everybody will have a patch. And, we will short circuit that process. And obviously, there's going to be corruption as a result of that. That we've seen it every time we've tried to have this privileged versus non-privileged. We've seen it with cement, where in the old days, you had, levy cement and non-levy cement. You still have it with sugar. So we're going to see all of this if we create this prioritization based on ability to pay. If we don't, then we have a fairer chance of getting it to the people who need it.
Well, fundamentally, as Murali has put it, it deals with the right to life, which is a fundamental right, and the right to equality, which is a fundamental right. So to say that just because I can pay, my life is more important than somebody else's, because it's not a question of who can and cannot pay. It's a question of how many of those doses we have as a country and who we're going to prioritize, who needs to get it first. So if we create a system where you can short circuit and you can get to the front of that line because of your ability to pay, we're effectively telling rich people that they are more important and are more entitled to live, and I'm using the word entitled here, than people who don't have money. And that goes fundamentally against the basis of our democracy. Very quickly, Dr. Jameel, a couple of questions for you. This is a good question, actually. There's news from the UK saying Pfizer and Astra shots are going to be combined in order to increase their efficacy. What does that mean? How does that work? Are we now trying cocktails? And does that make sense?
You can't do that. The vaccine that you take, the first shot, needs to be the same vaccine that you take as the second shot. You can't do that.
Right, so it can't be done. So I'm actually just looking at a Bloomberg article, which is
there is a report of it, especially with the Sputnik vaccine. They're trying to do a combo of some kind. So
no, Sputnik is different.
I'm just saying that there is a
they
chance.
Use two different serotypes of adenovirus.
Correct. So it is possible with the Sputnik vaccine, perhaps not with the AstraZeneca one. So let's be very clear on which ones you can do and which ones you can't.
Okay. And I will give the last word of this conversation to Dr. Reddy, because effectively we've all hung our hats on you, Doc, to be able to save the country. No pressure.
Well, what is there a specific question, or you want me to comment on this?
So my question, the question.
Just go ahead and save the country. That's it.
Yes.
We talked about people cutting the line. Where are the solutions for? Are there solutions for all these things?
No, I fully agree that we have to have a system in which everybody who needs the vaccine and is prioritized on very credible criteria gets it. And otherwise, what's going to happen is that a limited number will get it, particularly those who are privileged will be able to access it. Then you will have the private sector being given an opportunity to dispense the vaccine. And then you will have airlines, shops, offices, employers saying that you can't enter without having a vaccination certificate. And then the private sector will be charging a high price for that. And that is where people are going to be held to ransom. And as you said, these apps can be also very problematic wherever you go. And as we enter 2021, we don't want to enter it singing Happy New Year with more apps.
Happy New Year, indeed. Still, people are asking, do you recommend taking the vaccine? Abigail, I want to go back to the beginning of this conversation. We're talking about the fact that it's not a question of choice. This is, in an ideal world, a choice that should be left with the government as to who needs to take the vaccine, and those are the people who have to get the vaccine. It's interesting that at a time when we're not really sure if we're going to be able to get the vaccine to the right people who have access to healthcare, which means those of us who access private healthcare, say, I don't know if I want to take it, which means we automatically believe we will have that choice. That really should make us stop and think. We're so privileged and so entitled that we think that the choice is going to present itself to us in the very early days. And that should make us stop and think where we place ourselves in the pyramid of this country and why that is. I'm going to leave it here. I really want to thank all of you for making time, for being so patient, for being so generous, and for answering all of these questions. I do hope that some of this reaches the ears of those making decisions in the government. And people like you on the panel advise the government to do this right, because putting it in the most simplistic way, it's a life and death question for all of us. So for now, hopefully, keep your masks on, guys. Sanitize, social distance. It's the best we can do until presented with the choice of the vaccine, if that ever comes. But for now, we have to look after ourselves, and that responsibility doesn't go away. Thanks for watching. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.